In the winter of his life, the most powerful man in the known world sat alone in a military tent on the frozen edge of the Roman frontier and wrote a sentence to no one, not to his generals, not to his senate, not even to be read by another living soul. He wrote it to himself, in Greek, by lamplight, somewhere along the Danube, while the empire he ruled bled from a war that would not end and a plague that would not stop counting bodies. That man was Marcus Aurelius, and the words he scratched into that private notebook were never meant to survive him. Yet here we are, nearly 2,000 years later, still opening the same pages, still searching for the same thing he was searching for that night. A way to stay steady when everything around you refuses to be. If you have ever felt like you're managing a life, instead of living one, pulled between duties you didn't choose, grief you didn't ask for, and a world that keeps handing you problems faster than you can solve them, this is not a coincidence. It's the human condition, and Marcus knew it intimately. What follows isn't a list of ancient trivia. It's a set of working tools, tested by a man who buried children, ruled through pandemic and war, and somehow still wrote, night after night, about how to become a better person before morning came. I won't promise you transformation by sunrise. I'll promise you something more honest. 10 ideas sturdy enough to hold weight when your own thinking gives way. Stay to the end, because the final principle is the one that quietly reframes all the others, and it's the one Marcus seemed to return to most, especially near the close of his own life. The principles. 1. Start with what is actually yours. Marcus returns again and again to a distinction so simple it's almost easy to dismiss that some things are within our power, and most things are not. Our judgments, our intentions, our effort. Other people's opinions, the outcome of a war, the arrival of a plague. Not ours. Think of the last time you lay awake, replaying something someone said about you, turning it over for hours, as if enough thinking might undo it. Marcus, ruling an empire mid-collapse, didn't have hours to spare on things he couldn't touch. So today, try this. The next time something knocks you off balance, ask one question before reacting: is this actually mine to control? If not, let your grip loosen. Then practice letting go of the rest. Knowing the boundary between what's yours and what isn't is only step one. The harder discipline is actually releasing your grip on the far side of that line. This is where most people quietly fail. They can name what isn't theirs to control, and still spend all day white-knuckling it anyway. Marcus wasn't immune to this either. His journal is full of him re-arguing himself back to the same conclusion, which tells you it never became fully automatic, even for him. It's a practice, not a switch. So pick one thing right now that you've been gripping: an outcome, a person's reaction, a decision that's already been made, and consciously, physically exhale as you set it down. You may have to do it again in an hour. That's fine. That's what practice means. What does a person do, though, once they've stopped wasting energy on the uncontrollable? They still have to face what's actually blocking them. And Marcus had a strange, almost defiant answer to that too. Treat the obstacle as the material, not the enemy. This is one of the ideas he circles back to most. And for good reason. It's the hinge his whole philosophy turns on. The thing standing in your way, he suggests, isn't separate from your task. It is your task, in a different shape. A blocked path doesn't cancel the journey. It becomes the new terrain to work with. Now hold that against what we know of his actual life. A man who inherited a war he didn't start, a co-emperor, Lucius Verus, who would die partway through it, and a capital city hollowed out by disease while he was hundreds of miles away commanding troops. He didn't get the reign he expected. He got the one he had, and by every account, he used it, rather than waiting for the one he wanted to arrive. So, look at whatever is currently in your way.
3. A difficult boss. 3.
A plan that collapsed last month. What would it look like to stop treating that thing as a delay to your real life and start treating it as the raw material your real life is actually made of? Pick one obstacle today and name, out loud if you have to, what it's teaching you that ease never could. 4. Judge yourself by effort, not by outcome. This follows directly from the last idea, and it's worth pulling apart on its own, because we tend to conflate the two constantly. A doctor can perform a surgery flawlessly and still lose the patient. A general can plan a campaign with total soundness and still face weather, disease, or betrayal that undoes it. Marcus lived that exact reality for years on the frontier. If the measure of a good day is always the result, you will spend your whole life at the mercy of forces that were never yours to command in the first place. Marcus's private answer was to relocate the scoreboard. Did I act with reason, with care, with integrity, given what I knew? That's the only question that's fully answerable by you. Tonight, instead of asking, how did today go, try asking, did I show up the way I intended to? And let that be the number that actually counts. There's a quieter cousin to this idea, one that doesn't announce itself as boldly, but works just as hard underneath everything else. 5. Narrow your attention to the hour you're actually in. Regret lives in the past. Anxiety lives in the future. Marcus's journal is, again and again, an exercise in returning to the present, the task at hand, the person in front of him, the sentence he's writing right now. It sounds almost too simple to be useful, until you notice how rarely you actually do it. How much of today have you spent partly somewhere else replaying yesterday, rehearsing tomorrow while the actual present moment went by half-attended? Try narrowing the aperture, just for the next task you do. Not your whole day. Just this one thing. But a life lived only for oneself, even a perfectly present one, would have struck Marcus as incomplete. He had a stronger claim on his attention than his own comfort. 6. Remember, you are a limb, not an island. One of the most persistent images in meditations is the human community as a single body, each person a limb working or failing to work with the others. Marcus wasn't a private philosopher who happened to also run an empire. The two were, in his mind, the same project. Acting against the interests of other people in his framing is like a hand acting against the arm it's attached to, technically possible, but a kind of self-injury. This isn't abstract for us either. Think of the colleague you've been quietly resenting instead of talking to, or the family member you've written off as not worth the effort. What's one small act of genuine cooperation you could offer today? Not because you feel like it, but because you recognize the limb doesn't get to opt out of the body. And underneath all of this, the discipline over what's controllable, the reframing of obstacles, the presence, the duty to others. There's a harder question Marcus never let himself avoid. 7. Let what actually matters be the only thing that counts as a win. Wealth, status, reputation, comfort, Marcus calls these indifference. Not because they're worthless, but because they're not where the real scoreboard is kept. the real scoreboard for a Stoic tracks wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance character, in other words, not circumstance. An emperor who had every external marker of success available to him still wrote, privately, about the emptiness of chasing those things for their own sake. So here's the uncomfortable audit. Where in your life have you quietly let an indifferent, a title, a follow account, someone else's approval start functioning as your definition of a good day? What would it mean to move the goalpost back to something you actually control, like whether you acted with integrity today, regardless of what it earned you? 8. Question: what's actually yours to be angry about? Anger, for Marcus, is almost always a case of mistaken ownership. We get furious at other people's failures of judgment, as if their failures were somehow a debt owed to us personally. Someone breaks a promise, cuts you off in traffic, disappoints you at work, and the sting isn't only the event itself. It's the sense that they owed you better. Marcus's private answer wasn't to suppress the anger, but to interrogate it. Is this person acting from ignorance, the way most people act from ignorance most of the time? That doesn't excuse the behavior, but it changes what you owe the moment in return. The next time you feel that flash of fury rising, try one small delay, a single breath before you decide it deserves to run your next action. Now we arrive at the idea that seems to unsettle people the most on first hearing, and that Marcus, remarkably, treated as a source of relief rather than dread. 9. Let mortality clarify you. Instead of frightening you, he had buried children. He had watched a plague empty out neighborhoods of the city he governed. Death was not an abstraction to Marcus Aurelius. It was a colleague he worked alongside for most of his adult life. And yet his writing on the subject isn't morbid, it's almost bracing. The awareness that time is finite, he suggests, is precisely what should sharpen your attention to what's in front of you now, rather than numbing you into avoidance. This is the theme later cultures would compress into the phrase, Memento Mori. Remember, you will die, though that exact Latin shorthand isn't a line lifted straight from his journal. It's a legacy of the tradition he helped shape. Think about how differently you'd spend this evening if you genuinely believed it might be one of your last few hundred. Not with panic. One concrete practice. Before you sleep tonight, name one thing you did today that you'd be at peace with if it turned out to be your final ordinary day. With attention. That's not despair. That's the clarity he was after. And once mortality has done its work of sharpening you, Marcus offers one more move, the widest lens of all, the one that seems to be where he lands most often when a problem feels unbearably large. 10. Zoom out until the wound gets smaller. Again and again in his private writing, Marcus pulls back from whatever crisis is consuming him: a war, a betrayal, a loss to the scale of cosmic time. Empires rise and dissolve. Names that once meant everything are eventually spoken by no one. This isn't nihilism in his hands. It's medicine. The thing that feels unbearable at the scale of today often becomes survivable, even small, at the scale of a life, and vanishingly small at the scale of history. The next time something feels like it's swallowing you whole, try physically stepping back, literally leave the room, or step outside and ask what this will weigh a decade from now. Most things get lighter almost immediately when you do that.